Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Wong, and I am presenting Empathetic Design Systems today. So here's some photos of me. I really love animals, as you can tell. I work as a software engineer, currently nowhere, and you can find me on the internet at Genzor on GitHub or at MyBlueWrestband on Twitter. So as I said, I work nowhere currently, so maybe you can hire me. To get started, I would like to ask, what is a design system? How many people know what a design system is? Raise your hands. Okay, so a small percentage. And then how many people have worked on design systems? Raise your hands. And even smaller, I just see a couple of people raising their hands. Okay, well, I'm here to tell you that design systems are super trendy right now. So I'm pretty sure they got started probably sometime around 2013. Brad Frost coined the term atomic design around that year. And so that's kind of my assumption of when a design system got started. So here you see UXPin describes a design system as a complete set of design standards, documentation, and principles, along with a toolkit, UI patterns, and code components to achieve those standards. So you've probably heard the terms pattern library, component library, or style guide in reference to a design system, but I like to say that a rose by any other name is probably just a design system. So these three things are actually pieces of a design system. A pattern library is a set of design patterns for use across an entire company, so different UI patterns in general. A component library is a set of commonly used elements for use across an entire company. And a style guide is static documentation that describes the design system itself. So how products should look and feel, use cases for those different UI patterns, which we talked about earlier, correct typographic scales, colors, things like that. So let's take a look at some design systems, and there are design systems of all sizes. The first example I have here is called Spectrum. Spectrum is produced by Adobe, and I first heard about it from a talk by a woman named Sarah Fetterman at a conference called Forward.js. So you can see here a screenshot of every iteration of a button that Adobe uses across all of their hundreds of products and services. So just imagine having to figure out what button you should use from this entire screenshot. So they have actually, Adobe is huge, so it makes sense that their design system is huge. They have an entire team just dedicated to maintaining their design system, Spectrum. Here's another example. So we in the US, where I'm from, we have a web design system that is part of the government. So it's created by this consultancy called 18F, which lives inside of the US government. And it's actually public and open source because as it's the government, it belongs to everyone. So this is every iteration of button used by the US government, and it's used by dozens of government agencies across hundreds of websites. So these buttons are actually all the same across all different devices. So different from Adobe, much less buttons. So this is a style guide created by Mozilla, which is also open source and accessible at mozilla.design. When I first started showing this screenshot, it actually had a very outdated design system that was out of use, and I actually just checked on this yesterday, so they've updated it now. And basically what it is, it's more of a style guide, so they talk about different fonts, they talk about different colors and things you should use across Mozilla's different products. So it's more of a style guide and less of a design system. But doing a bit more digging, there's actually a design system called Photon, and Photon exists as part of Mozilla's product Firefox. So this is their design system specifically just for their browser. And this was last updated a few months ago, and it's also open source. So those are some examples of design systems that exist today. So what is empathy? How many people know what empathy is? Raise your hand. Okay, that's most people in the crowd. But for those of you who don't know, empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So the word comes from the two Greek words em and pathos, which means to be in feeling. So it's like this the feeling of being in feeling with other people. And if you look at the Google Books Ngram Viewer, you can see that the use of the word empathy has gone up in the last 60 years or so. So just like design systems, empathy is super in fashion right now too. So I took a look at this survey called UXPin, by UXPin, called the Enterprise UX Industry Report. This was done in 2018, and they surveyed about 3,200 people around the world. Most of the people responding were UX or product designers. Some were UI designers, and many of them were visual designers, interaction designers, and also developers. So UXPin, just for reference, is a collaborative design platform that's used for prototyping and systems-based software. So they ran this survey, and they asked the question, what challenges do you currently face in your UX process? And I took a look at these and I realized a lot of these challenges actually relate to empathy. So the first few, improving UX consistency, testing designs with users, clarifying requirements. All of these things are kind of working with your product manager and your designers if you are a developer. There's also collaborating between teams and getting buy-in or understanding from executives, and then handing off designs to developers. So it's a lot of like interpersonal connection between people that you work with or the users that you may create products for. So when we talk about empathy, we are talking about things like teamwork, just like these people and these dogs working together. We also talk about the feeling of being in one another's shoes. And then we also talk about just kind of like having a general understanding for each other. So for me, like when I'm working as a developer, what I like to talk about is avoiding that over-the-wall design. So if I'm working with designers, making sure that when something gets designed, you don't throw it over a wall to the developers, and then the developers create something and then throw that back over the wall to the designers. You actually work together towards a common goal. So now let's talk about a design system at a company where I used to work. So first of all, why did we want to create a design system? And the reason was that design systems are popular, as I was saying, and we wanted to move into the future. Specifically, if we take a look at this UXPin survey again, the problems we were trying to solve were improving UX consistency, collaborating between teams, and then also getting rid of our legacy technology. So when did we decide to create this design system? Well, first off, we were, again, trying to improve UX consistency. So we did it during a company rebrand. We were also trying to get rid of legacy technology. And essentially what we were doing here was we were trying to replace an old style guide with our new design system. And that meant we were also moving from Backbone over to React. So because React is super popular, we also wanted to make sure that we are moving into new technologies. So I like to make a joke that primarily we kind of wanted to do this for popularity reasons. So initially what we were thinking about with the company rebrand was like improving public relations and maybe making our design system open source over time. We could write blog posts about this or, give a conference talk about this design system. So a lot of the reasons for creating this design system originally were very motivated by ourselves instead of by the people that we were trying to serve. So initially, what we did was we started to do a lot of exploration, which was driven by our branding team. So you can see here a screenshot of different things they were thinking about in terms of the rebranding of the company. And who were the people working on this design system? We had a group called our front-end foundry team, and that consisted of 3 of our most senior front-end developers, and then 3 of our entry-level engineers that were coming in from boot camps. We had 1 product manager who originally was a design manager, and we also had the entire design team working on this. So it could be up to 15 designers at any given time. So it was quite a lot of people that were working on this design system. So again, we were trying to replace our style guide, which was, to us, old school. And some details about that style guide we were trying to replace. is that we were using this thing called KSS, which stands for Nile Style Sheets, because it was created by a man named Kyle Neath. And what KSS did was it would auto-generate style guide documentation in HTML and CSS. So here you can see it hasn't been updated in many years, so very old technology by this point. And this is kind of what KSS looks like. So what you'll see above is a bunch of comments in our CSS, and then below that, the styles and the selectors that are created by us. So essentially what was happening was the comment piece was being automatically generated by KSS. So the problem with KSS was that it was very brittle, and our old style guide as well. So we had no systematic way of adding new features or styles. People just kind of added styles willy-nilly with no particular rules or order to it. The cascade of these style sheets often meant that styles overwrote each other. And then the comment style sectioning and the numbering required us to actually manually go in and change different things at any given time. So here, it's a little bit hard to see, but what you see here is there's a selector called .button/bright, and then with the pseudo selector hover. So if I look at that, I'm like, well, I don't really know what a bright button is. And then below that, you can see in one of the comments, basically in the HTML, we have this modifier classes. And I'm like, if I come to here, I don't really know what a modifier class is. And then lastly, you can see the sectioning. So it says Style Guide 2.6. But again, if I come here, how do I know where to find those styles? And like, what is section 2.6? So in comes the shiny new design system. Nathan Curtis says that a style guide is an artifact of a design process, whereas a design system is a living, funded product with a roadmap and backlog serving an ecosystem. And we could see by our project that that was correct because we had a product manager behind it and we had many, many designers working on it as well. So some things that we got right with our design system when we first started working on it. Number one, we started with what we called a component generator. So we're using this thing called plop.js, which creates a boilerplate of code files. So essentially what you could do was input your component name, and it would generate a bunch of things like your JS files, your CSS files, your HTML files, and then a bunch of unit tests and then documentation around that. So that was great because we had consistency across all of the components that were being created. Another thing that we did well was our documentation. So we had a bunch of onboarding documentation for anyone who is new to the design system to talk about how to use the design system and then how to contribute to the design system. We also specifically started with atomic design, so making sure that we had small components that were built up into larger components over time. So making sure we started small and then got bigger. We also had this thing called a planned approach, which was a structured way of adding new components. And what that meant for us was that we would get together with one engineer or more from the front-end Foundry team, as well as one designer, and we would talk about the component that needed to be built before we actually started coding it or even designing it. We also did decently well at accessibility. So we started off and we included this ESLint plugin for accessibility to make sure that anything that could be tested with accessibility in general was okay. And then actually we did a lot of focus on our modals to make sure that those things were very accessible. Because if anyone has worked in accessibility before, you know that working with modals is very difficult when making sure that they're accessible. So those are things we did right. But we also had some problems, and I like to say that they were caused by a lack of empathy. So first off was our search. So I always say, and many other people say, that you don't know what you don't know. So if you come to this page and you're looking for a thing called a dropdown, you can see that there are two results that pop up. You see a dropdown and also a dropdown menu. But I also noticed that the dropdown and the dropdown menu are both subcomponents of a component called dropdown. So what is a drop-down then? Like, you don't know what you don't know, and it's very difficult to tell what's going on here. Another issue that we had, as you can tell from the drop-down, was naming things. So we had a thing called a drop-down, which is also a subcomponent of drop-down, and then the drop-down menu. So naming things is hard. Similarly, the design system originally was called EDS as an acronym. So it's called E's Design System, and it was formerly known as Black Panda. So anyone who's new to the design system hears the term Black Panda and they're just like, what are you talking about? Another issue we had was trying to tell if something was deprecated. Maybe it's deprecated, maybe not. So you see here there's a warning and it says that the component is unstable and subject to change. But what does unstable mean and what does subject to change mean? And where can I find more information about this? There's no link, it doesn't say, and I don't know if I can keep using this component or not. Another issue we ran into, actually I specifically ran into this one, was the difference between a text input and an input field. So this was another deprecation issue, and we, as a team, started using this component called a text input in one of our new features, not knowing that the design team of the design system had decided to create a new component called an input field. So what happened was we actually had to replace all of our text inputs with an input field, and that delayed our roadmap and the release of our new product. Another issue we had was component confusion. When and where do I use the component that I'm looking for? So here you can see I have the drop-down, which I mentioned earlier. You can see the drop-down menu, which I mentioned earlier as well, and those two are on the left. On the right, you see a select, and then below that you see something called a select field. So presumably all of these things probably have a title with a little arrow that when you click on it or you hover over it, drops down and shows you different options you can choose from, right? Well, I don't actually know. So all of these could be the same component, and I would really have no idea without testing them. Another issue that we saw was that selects are notoriously hard to customize. So I don't actually know if this is a native select or something that we've created ourselves. And again, naming is hard. So we have the drop-down menu. The select field is actually a subcomponent of the input field, and then we also have a select component. Another issue we had was allowing our designers to contribute to the design system. It's very difficult in the documentation to tell where the CSS lives. So here you can see an example of our button, and unfortunately, you can see the classes that belong to this button, but you can't see where the CSS is. The CSS is not included in the documentation, and it's very difficult to just add the CSS. Another issue we ran into was that because everything was in React, and React has a steep learning curve for someone who's never done software engineering or development work before, it required all of our designers to learn React in order to actually contribute to the CSS. So here you can see the button folder now has much more to analyze within it instead of just having one CSS file. And then the other issue was this new CSS file has many more imports from different components across our design system. Another issue I saw was one related to the grid system and our alignment classes. So there is a component that was widely shared that was created by another team. And unfortunately, what the issue was that we actually had the component using Flexbox, but then within that, it was using our alignment classes. And our alignment classes actually use display inline block. So those two, of course, interfered with each other. And so I went in and I was like, okay, I'm just going to correct this component so that it only uses either Flexbox or it uses inline block. And then because so many other teams were using that component, it just messed up everyone's features. So the communication was very difficult there in talking about why you should use one or the other instead of using both at the same time. So this was like an issue of unknown effects. So this is I guess, a longer explanation of what happened. So I had the widely shared component. I used it in my features and edited the styles, and it affected everyone else's features without me knowing about that. Eventually, I was able to discover the cause behind that. And again, it's the inline block versus the flexbox issue. And then you can see these two conflicting with each other, just like me and the other team. Another issue we ran into was our release process. So the release process of the design system is very complicated. Front-End Foundry would release a new version of the design system once a week. And then that design system needed to be bumped in our core repository, which required even more time. So feature teams, such as the team I was working on, were required to wait until Front-End Foundry decided that it was time for the design system to be released. So it could be a full week until I could actually get my feature to be released because of the waiting for the design system. So going back to the survey, I think we did a pretty good job of replacing our legacy technology. We were pretty quickly off of KSS and onto React. And then we did a decent job of also improving our UX consistency across the code base with our new components. But unfortunately, collaboration between the teams definitely needed some work. So some solutions that we found using empathy. The first was to plan for a better search, so having better discoverability. Some ideas that the designers had were to change the navigation bar so there was like less spacing, and then you could see most of the different names of the components instead of having to search down, like go down the page and search for them. Another issue was allowing us to search information across the code base. So the other idea was instead of just searching for the name of the component, you could search for different keywords related to that component as well. And then the other idea that was that the designers had was to have images of the different components on the homepage so you knew what you were looking for just based on the visuals. So eventually, that was the plan. Unfortunately, when I was working at this previous company, I never actually got to see that happen. But presumably and hopefully, that's something that they worked on. Another thing that we worked on was making sure that naming things was easy. So no more of these code names like Black Panda, no more use of acronyms like EDS. So we purged the code base of the use of those two terms and then made sure that we were very obvious in what we were talking about. A good example is we actually, when I worked for Meetup, we had a rule that if you used an acronym, you had to explain what the acronym was so that anyone who was new knew what you were talking about. So eventually, the plan was to purge, remember, to not use those terms anymore, and then also to explain them when you use them. Another thing that empathy helped with was communication. So before, people used to hoard a lot of information and just not share it across the team. So to help with that, we had Front-End Guild, which was just a way for us to have meetings, weekly meetings between all the front-end engineers. And then we also started a design system Slack channel. Another thing we worked on related to communication was during this Front-End Foundry team or Front-End Guild meeting, I explained the differences between the grid system and the alignment classes and the nuances between both and why you shouldn't use both at the same time. So again, that was related to a different component. Another thing related to communication that we worked on was the text input versus input field. So making sure that when the design team wanted to create a new component that was going to replace a deprecated one, that we communicated that outwards before people started using an old component that they didn't need. Another thing that we wanted to work on too was component clarity. So having usage guidelines written by our UX designers related to those components. So essentially, if you came to a component page, there would be usage guidelines telling you when and where you should be using this component so that you would be using it in the proper place instead of like maybe a drop down instead of a select, or getting those two mixed up. Another thing we worked on was getting designers up to speed using React. So there's this thing called React Studio, which allows designers to create mockups, and it auto-generates JSX related to those mockups. So it kind of gives designers a really good sense of what React will look like related to the thing that they're designing. So you can see here a screenshot of the auto-generated JSX in React Studio. Another thing that's a great learning tool for designers who are learning React is this product called Framer. So you can see it does a very similar thing where you have a mockup and then it auto-generates this JSX for the designers to see. Another thing we worked on was our release process. So you can see here, we wanted to create a release process for all people instead of just front-end Foundry. So one of the engineers that was on the front-end Foundry team, she created this bot which would nominate different people to go through the release process of the design system. And the releases would happen twice a week instead of once a week, which was great. So it doubled the amount of times it got released. Another thing about this bot that was great was it forced people into learning how the release process worked. So anyone could release the design system instead of just one very small team. And that was helpful, like with sharing knowledge instead of hoarding it, as I was saying earlier. So what are some things that you should do when you're creating a design system? You should empathize. You should think about who's going to be using your design system. Are designers going to be using it? Will product managers be looking at it? What about engineers, or maybe even your QA engineers, or even your marketing team? Like maybe your marketing team will be using it for your landing pages or different marketing websites. And then if your design system is open source, maybe external stakeholders need to know about what changes are happening as well. Also making sure that you share your information deeply and widely. Instead of keeping all the information to yourself, it's very important to communicate across all the different teams if you're working on a design system. Making sure that you write the docs, so have great documentation. Definitely having a good search is really important with the design system, and then having a centralized place to see what components have been designed, have been built, have modifications or subcomponents, and then which ones have been deprecated. So an example here, MDN has a page of deprecated features, which is super helpful because you can search and you know exactly which things have been deprecated and which things you shouldn't be using anymore. Having a process, like how do you make this component or this thing work? So having a step-by-step guide for someone to get started using a component, or better yet, having multiple or tailored usage guidelines for the different functions that may be using your design system. So maybe you have a different usage guideline system for designers than for engineers, or for product managers than for designers. Some helpful tools to get you started on your design system journey. This one is called Storybook, which is a UI development environment, and it's open source, which is super cool. It comes generally from an engineer's perspective, and here you can see it at work. So here you can see you're just like changing a bunch of the different styles of this button that you're creating, and it auto generates or changes what the button looks like in real time, which is super cool. Okay, and then there's also UXPin, which is a UX design platform, the company I mentioned earlier that ran that survey. And this tends to be more from a designer's perspective. So it basically has a way of like organizing your components or your designs for designers. And then before I keep going, one more case study. So this was at another company that I worked for, and what did we do? So I went to our head designer and I was like, hey, are we planning to build a design system? Because we didn't have one at the time. And he said, if you want to build a design system, start with one component. I was like, huh, that's a good idea. And I asked him, do we need a design system at this company? And he said, if you have to ask yourself that question, you don't need a design system. He's very, Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi in his thoughts around design. So what are design systems good for then? Are they good for absolutely nothing? Just kidding, they're not. So they can be good for public relations and marketing, like I had mentioned earlier, via blog posts, open source, giving presentations. And they can be like career building in a way. If you are on the team that's creating the design system, you're in front of the whole company of people who are going to be using those components or different things out of your design system. But don't forget what I've been talking about. There's a lot of pain and suffering along the way when you have to collaborate with so many different people. So if you are going to create a design system or it's something you'd like to pursue, first off, think about, do you have the resources to do this? Remember, we had an entire front-end Foundry team, which was 6 engineers, 1 product manager, and then up to 15 designers at any given point in time, which is 22 people. That's a lot of people just to dedicate it to one project. This other company where I worked, the design team was 1 design manager, 1 content strategist, and 5 designers, and that's it. It's only 7. So it didn't really make sense for us at the time to pursue a design system. Number 2, you should build what you need. So if you end up building ahead of your needs, you usually end up with a component that maybe you don't need, or maybe a component that doesn't meet the current needs that you have, or with a component that has extra features that aren't needed and get discarded in the future. So oftentimes, if you create too many things ahead of your needs, then it's hard to identify edge cases or cases where the component will be used. So for example, say you want to automate getting ketchup on your burger or your hot dog before you actually need to do that. Then you might end up with a machine like this. Like, we really probably don't need this machine for putting ketchup on your burger. So don't build ahead of your needs, just use your hand and squeeze the ketchup out. And then remember, with the text input and input field, we were kind of building ahead of our needs in terms of using that input field, because we could have kept using that text input and it would have been fine. And this probably would have saved time for future users of the design system. So think about trying to do first things first. Start with a component library. So here you can see, I forget what program this is, sorry about that, but basically it's a way for our designers to organize all of the different components and designs that they have. So this is kind of a first things first, starting with one component or just starting with your designs. So you can see here this thing called libraries. And inside of that, we have these things called symbols, font styles, colors, and our icons. So just starting with like general style guide type things can be really helpful if you're thinking about creating a design system. Other advice I have is to solve one problem at a time. So one problem that we had was an issue with icons. So we wanted to create one solution to a problem that many of us had. So before, with icons, if we needed to use an icon or if we needed to create an icon, we would start off by reaching out to the one visual designer that created icons. The issue with our icons specifically was that there were lots of different icons in different places, named different things across our code base. So maybe you could ask a designer and say, like, where does this icon live? But maybe they would give you one place and it would be living somewhere else by a different name. So another issue we had also with icons was, again, the issue of naming things. So we had different icons named X or close or cross. And I was like, which one is the correct one? Or are they all exactly the same? I don't know. Presumably they all look like an X. So we decided to add empathy to this, and one of our engineers worked with that visual designer who created all of the icons. And they created this thing called an icon library, which was super cool. It was a Hack Week project, and basically, again, it had everything on one page, so you could see all of your icons and figure out exactly which one you needed. Another thing you could do was you could select the size, you could select the style, and then you could also select the color. So here I'm changing it to red and a solid, which is pretty cool. And then you could just export that file and put it in the right place. So this icon library had empathy for all the designers that might be using our icons, all of the engineers that might be using our icons, and then any content creator that was using those icons as well. So we had really good teamwork. Engineering and design were hand in hand on that project. Another issue that we wanted to pursue was our CSS styles. So in our core code base, the issue was that a lot of our CSS was CSS spaghetti. It was just like all over the place. This is a screenshot not of the CSS. Fortunately, I don't have access to it anymore, so it's like hiding somewhere. But it was kind of a mess. And the issue was that we had no centralized location for our classes. They lived in different locations, as well as like in different repositories. So, and the other issue was that we didn't have a lot of coverage in our CSS or the CSS we needed, and there were a lot of repeat styles between those repositories. So in comes this tool called Tailwind CSS, which is a utility for our CSS framework. You can see here the Tailwind cursor styles, and you can see they're very thorough. There are all types of classes that already exist for these cursor styles. It's very easy to use Tailwind to build up all of the different classes and styles that you need. So again, this has empathy for designers and engineers and content creators who will use or modify any of the CSS that exists at this company. And I just want to say thanks to Eric, because he introduced Tailwind CSS to that company, which was super cool. And he's also looking for a job, so you can hire him too. Okay, so in conclusion, do as I say and not as I do. So I'm telling you all to empathize with your users and your fellow coworkers across different departments, because we didn't do such a great job of it at the companies where I used to work. So you should learn from all of our mistakes. So make sure you think about your users, your collaborators, and your coworkers when you're creating a design system. And then again, if your company is still small, do as small companies do, and maybe hold off and think about using or creating a design system before you have the resources behind that. So using empathy, build what you need and what your team needs. Start with a small component and make sure your team has the time. Solve one problem at a time, and preferably a problem that affects many people instead of just yourself. And then I have some resources here, and that's all I have for y'all.